You're watching LMCC.
Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Kay Erickson with the League of Women Voters of South Tonka. And today we're talking about Minnesota's presidential nomination primary and the 2020 census. My first guest is Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon. We're going to be talking about the presidential primary where this year Minnesotans will be able to go to the polls and vote for the presidential candidate that they think should be on their party's ballot in November. This is the first time in nearly 30 years that Minnesotans have had an opportunity to do this. But there's some changes this year in the way we normally run primaries that you're going to want to hear about. And then in the second part of our program, we're going to be talking about the census with State Demographer Susan Brower and Paul Huffman with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. We'll be talking about how crucial it is that every single person in Minnesota gets counted this year. Welcome, Secretary Simon. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
Now, the 2016 legislature passed a law that provides this presidential primary this year. But before we talk about this particular election, I'd like to talk about primaries in general. Primary elections are different from general elections, even though they look the same, and I think even our regular primary elections are somewhat confusing sometimes. So can you explain how the goal of primary elections and how those work compared to general elections?
Sure. Well, the general election is where we elect someone to an actual office. So at the end of the process in a general election, someone's going to raise a hand and swear an oath and take office. That's not the case with primary elections. Now, there are two kinds of primary elections. There's the one we're going to have in August, and we always do. That's the process by which political parties winnow down to one somebody to be the nominee for an office. So if there are 5 Democrats running for governor, there's a primary, and one is left standing. What we're in the middle of right now is a different species of primary. We're calling it the presidential nominating primary. At the end of this process, no one wins an office or even wins a nomination. No one raises a hand or takes an oath. What happens here is this is the way that Minnesota has chosen to help the major parties allocate their delegates to the national convention. It's a little complicated, but bottom line is candidates are going to come out of Minnesota. They're going to have delegates to the national conventions that they hope will build a majority and make them the nominee. And Minnesota has chosen since 2016 to move from our old caucus system for doing that process to now a primary system, which is a straight up real election in real polling places, just like people are used to in November. Only here, we're not electing someone to an office, we're helping the parties allocate delegates.
And in some ways, this will look like regular primaries and regular elections. I mean, people will go to the polls. Is their polling place going to change, or
Nope.
is it
Same polling place they're used to.
Same hours?
Same hours.
You can get off work to vote.
That's right.
You have absentee ballots.
Correct.
That can take place. Actually, early voting has already started.
That's
and
right.
The primary election is actually March 3rd. So some things are the same. How old do you have to be to vote in this primary?
That's key. You have to be 18.
And that's different, isn't it?
That is. In the caucus system, to participate in the caucuses, you just had to be 18 by November.
Okay.
That's not the case here.
Okay.
You have to be 18 by March 3rd to participate. If you're not, you can't participate.
Okay. And other races are not going to be on the ballot.
Correct. Just this one contest for President of the United States.
Now, which parties are eligible to participate in this particular primary? That's different.
Well, Minnesota now has 4 major political parties. 4. We have the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and 2 parties dedicated to the legalization of marijuana use. So those are the 4 major parties. All are entitled to participate, but only 2 chose to participate. The Democratic and Republican parties will be participating in the primary. The other 2 parties I mentioned opted not to participate in the presidential primary.
Okay. So in order to participate, you don't have to hold a national convention.
Well, in order to participate, yes, you are supposed to hold a national convention, but even then you don't have to participate, and the 2 marijuana parties chose not to.
Okay. So who determined what candidates ended up on this primary ballot?
That's a little unusual. The way the legislature wrote the law in 2016 is they gave that power to the party chairs. So the chair of the Republican Party and the chair of the Democratic Party in Minnesota, they say who's on the ballot. That's different. Normally in elections in Minnesota, there's a filing period, or there's candidate registration, and whoever can register and pay the fee, they can be on that ballot. That's not the case with this contest. It's only the party chairs who have the ability to determine who's on the ballot.
So let's go through what a voter will experience when they enter the polling place, because some things will change pretty quickly.
Yes.
They walk in the door and they sign in.
That's right.
And then they ask an election judge for a ballot, and that's where it gets different. Can you talk about that?
That's right. The legislature in 2016, for a lot of reasons, decided to have separate ballots. So this is not something we're used to in Minnesota.
It's not.
Instead of one ballot featuring multiple parties and multiple contests, there's going to be separate ballots. So the voter who votes on game day on March 3rd will have to tell the election judge, or point, you don't have to say it out loud, please give me the Democratic Party ballot, or please give me the Republican Party ballot. And here's the interesting part, and I think the unfortunate part in my view. The record of which ballot that a voter has chosen, not the record of who they voted for, we still have a secret ballot, so no one will know who you voted for, but the record of which party's ballot the voter chose will be made available to all 4 major political parties, all 4. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and both marijuana parties, even though they're not participating, because they're major parties, all 4 parties will get that list and be able to tell who picked which party's ballot. I think that's unfortunate. I have some legislation before the Minnesota legislature that would change that, that would guarantee some voter privacy, but that is the rule for now.
What will the major party chairs do with that information? Are there any restrictions at all on what they are allowed to do?
Well, that, again, is the unfortunate part. There are no restrictions on what the parties can do with that data. Now, I want to make clear, I think I believe them and take them at their word when they say they intend to safeguard this data. But right now, there's no law in place that makes them do that. So technically speaking, if one of the 4 parties wanted to simply post the list online, if they wanted to, I'm not saying they do, they could do that. And that, I think, is disturbing. And there are a lot of Minnesotans, a lot, that I've talked to personally, that I've heard from through emails and phone calls and otherwise, who are really worried about the possibility that their political leaning will somehow get wide circulation. Because 4 different entities now, 1, their chosen political party, but 3 that aren't their chosen political party, are going to get that information.
Are you hearing from a lot of people that this is a problem for them?
Yes, and sometimes it has to do with what people's jobs are. You can imagine people in certain professions, whether it's journalism or small business owner or a school administrator, a member of the clergy, certain professions that really need to project balance and objectivity. And they're troubled by the prospect that their leanings could get out there, and I don't blame them. So I think we need to rein that in and lock down that data, and that's what I intend to try to do, but it depends on the legislature.
Now, when they walk into that poll and they ask for their ballot, they also have to sign a statement about, can you explain the statement they have to sign?
Yeah. When voters choose a ballot, whichever party's ballot they choose, when they sign in, they are signing an oath saying that they generally agree with the principles of that party, at least as of that day. That was something put in place at the insistence of the national parties. Both the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee said, look, we need some guarantee that you won't have Republicans crossing over and voting in the Democratic primary and vice versa. And since Minnesota doesn't have party registration, you know, most states do, where you register as a Democrat or you register as a Republican. We don't have it, we never have. There's no other way to tell who is a self-described Democrat or Republican. So this was the way that the legislature decided to get that done.
Okay. Now, to be clear, personal information about voters, some of that has always been somewhat public. Your name, whether you voted, some of those kinds of things have always been public. How public has that information been? Is it just if a party wants it, they can get it, or can just anyone get that kind of information about whether you voted in the last election or not?
Well, I can speak for our office. So we keep a database that we make available for a fee to candidates and parties and others. And it includes 4 things: name, address, year of birth, and voter history. Not who someone voted for, we couldn't know that, but whether someone votes, you know, only in presidential elections, do they show up for absolutely everything, something in between. And that information is made available for a fee, but even then there are some restrictions. It can only be used for very narrow purposes. It can't be sold. It can't be used for commercial purposes, that kind of thing.
Okay.
It's those kinds of things that we need, in my opinion, for the presidential nominating primary as well. I would go even further. I would give everyone in Minnesota the ability to opt out of the list. Just say, take me off the list. We have that elsewhere in state law. I think that would go a long way towards convincing people that their personal political leanings aren't going to get out there in wide circulation.
Now, there have been a number of proposals by both parties about what we can do about this before this information gets released. Do you think there's any chance that some of that might change? And can you talk about some of those proposals?
Sure. Well, my proposal, the one that I hope will pass, and I hope the legislature will take a serious look at, would do three things. First, it would only give the data to a national party representative and only for the narrow purpose of determining voter eligibility. Okay. Second, it would make all of this data private data under state law, which means if you show it to anyone or give it to anyone, there are serious penalties, fines, etc. Third is the opt-out that we talked about. Everyone should be able to say, take me off the list, just as we do in other kinds of elections. That, I think, is a fair proposal that could really get traction. Look, in my perfect world, if I were emperor for a day and I could wave a magic wand, I'd want this to be like our August primary that some of your viewers are familiar with, where it's untraceable. It's one piece of paper. No one will ever know which side of the ballot you voted on. That is unlikely to happen, though that would be my first choice. This that I've just outlined is something that I think could pass. I hope the legislature will take a serious look at it.
Do the Republicans have some proposals for them of their own, or do the Democrats have their own proposals?
You know, there are a couple legislators who recently floated the idea of basically disallowing collection of any of this data. I think the issue there is that would junk the entire primary. The national parties would then not recognize it. So that's a way to torpedo the whole thing. I don't think that's likely to happen. That's why I think the legislation that I've offered has the best chance of actually getting enacted.
Okay. So basically, we've added an election to the whole schedule of elections in Minnesota. We still have caucuses in February.
That's right.
That happens before this primary election. And then we still have the primary in August.
Right.
And then we still have the regular general election November 3rd. And the date for pre-registering is September 18th, I think. Is that correct?
Actually, no, it'll be a little later than that.
Okay.
It'll be in mid-October.
Mid-October, okay,
but remember, Minnesota has same-day voter registration. So if any voter hasn't registered yet and wants to, or needs to change their registration, no problem. Minnesota is one of the few states in the country. It's a great law. You can just go to your polling place on game day and register right there.
Okay. You know, we've talked before in previous programs about cybersecurity and the issue of making sure our elections are secure. Can you talk a little bit about how your office has dealt with that since some of the funding has been released?
Yeah, we've dealt with it very aggressively and constantly. The number one threat to our election integrity in this country and in this state is the prospect that some adversary will try to mess with our democracy again. So we are on it. We have taken the federal money made available to us and purchased hardware and software and staffed up and gotten real experts in the field to help us. And we feel very good about where we are. No guarantees, of course. Just like the U of M or Target or U.S. Bank can't make any guarantees either. Neither can we, but I feel very good about where we are.
That's really good to know. I think that's always going to be a concern really this year to make sure that election is secure.
Yes.
If people have questions about the primary or any other election-related questions, can you tell them what website to go to?
Yes, the website is mnvotes.org, mnvotes.org. And let me just say, if I may, there are real advantages to having a presidential primary, notwithstanding the reservations I have about the data issue that we've discussed. I think it was the right move to go to a primary because it swings the doors wide open for many more people to participate, people who don't have 2 or 3 hours on a Tuesday to sit in a junior high gym. So we're lucky to have it, but we just got to iron out this data detail because that does concern me.
Yeah, and it concerns a lot of people, so it's good to know people are working on that. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your taking the time to be here and explain all of this, and good luck with the election.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
It's time for a short break. When we come back, I'll be talking about the 2020 census with State Demographer Susan Brower and Paul Huffman with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota.
Check out LMCC on Facebook. Be sure to like and friend us so you can keep up with all the happenings or to watch one of your favorite videos.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Kay Erickson with the League of Women Voters of South Tonka, and in this part of the program we'll be talking about the 2020 census, what it is and why it is so important to all of us that every person in Minnesota get counted this year. My guests are Susan Brower with the State Demographer and Paul Huffman with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. Welcome, Sue. Welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for being here. Susan, can you tell us a little bit about what you do as State Demographer?
Sure. So for most of the decade, my work is looking at demographic trends and reporting how they might impact policymakers' decisions. So a lot of number crunching. When it comes around the time of the census, my work is really heavily focused on making sure that Minnesotans know what the census is, why it's important, and making sure that we get an excellent count.
Thank you. Paul, can you tell us a little bit about what you do with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota?
Sure, Kay, thanks. I'm the coordinator of Census and Redistricting for League of Women Voters of Minnesota. In this role, what I do is I work with state and local leaders and government organizations to provide information, products, support to our members, over 2,000 members in 35 leagues in the state, who engage our members and educate our members and the community in these issues. And with regards to the census, it's been working with our leagues and members to engage the public, to encourage people to participate in the census to maximize the count.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's start with the basics. Can we start with what's the census, why is it important, why are we required to do this count every 10 years?
Sure. So the census is a count of every living, breathing human being who's living regularly in the U.S. So that includes everyone who's alive. Sometimes there's questions about citizenship. This is everyone who's alive. It's a head count. Its first purpose from the Constitution is that it is done to redistrict for representative government. So congressional apportionment is based on the census count, districting at the state level, for the federal level, city level, all kinds of government levels. The redistricting is based on the census count.
And why is it so important for funding of Minnesota?
Yeah, so in addition to the political representation, it's used for all kinds of funding formulas. There's $15 billion in funding each year that's distributed to Minnesota and Minnesota communities on the basis of the census count. And that's in all kinds of areas, from Medicaid to school lunch programs, transportation and highway planning, a range of programs that use the census count as one of the factors for distributing funds.
Wow.
And Kay, one of the things that I think it would be helpful is there are a large number of USDA programs that also are based on census. Things such as rural housing assistance and farm credits, rural electrification, which is still out there as a program that provides millions of dollars to rural Minnesota. So getting an accurate count is important to the whole state, and everybody should recognize that.
And when I was reading, I was interested in knowing that so much of that data is used by businesses and nonprofits. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So businesses use it to decide where to locate new outlets, new retail spots. They use it to try to figure out what their markets are and what their labor force is, what products they should put in stores. I'm thinking particularly of Target, and I know one of the census champions that we have working right now on the census has a long background in Target, figuring out where stores should go in Minnesota.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
something I don't know everybody thinks about.
Yeah, and I think, Susan, state government also uses a census for things like emergency services, social services, where are the people, where are the demographics that might drive that, right?
That's right. And even, across all kinds of programs, not just ones that require a population count, but ones that require rates. So even health programs, what's the rate of diabetes? You need to have that full count every 10 years to know what the denominator of those rates are.
Okay. Let's go back to the redistricting piece of it, because Minnesota is at risk of losing one of our representatives because we are so close to the line in terms of what's required to keep that eighth representative. Can you talk a little bit about that and the impact of that?
Sure. So Minnesota in 2010, after the 2010 census, we kept our 8th congressional district by just over 8,000 people. We were the very last state to receive a seat. The very last seat was doled out to Minnesota. And we're right back in that same position again in 2020. The estimates right now have us potentially losing a seat somewhere between about 7 to 22,000. But that's a number that I believe we can make up for with a good count.
And I think a perspective is, the population of Minnesota is about 5.7 million people. 1%, if we miss 1% of the people, that's 57,000 people. That's the difference between having 8 seats or 7 seats.
And that difference is huge, because if we have 7 instead of 8 representatives, those 7 representatives are going to have to represent a whole lot more people. And we're going to lose an elector that's going to the electoral college, because the number of senators and representatives is what determines how many electors Minnesota has at the national level for presidential elections. So
that's right. It has consequences for how well we're represented in Washington and how well we're represented in St. Paul at the state legislature as well.
There are a lot of communities that may not feel comfortable talking to government or reporting to government that they're living where they're living. How do you build trust with some of the harder to reach people so that they feel comfortable filling out the forms or even talking to someone?
So our strategy has been to work with community organizations and advocates and neighbors who already have the trust of people who we know are going to be less likely to respond to the census. So we're working on working through relationships that already exist and getting out in front of the census mailing. It's really been a kind of peer-to-peer, neighbor-to-neighbor type of a campaign.
I think a couple of things. There's a state-level complete count committee, which the Demographer's office leads with the state, and we participate in that. But there's, last I looked, about 250 complete count committees throughout the state, and some of these are based in churches, some of these are based in community organizations and universities, and so they're each working with their community to communicate, reinforce the census, share information with them about how they can participate, why it's safe to participate in the census. So, and for us at the League, we're really focused, as Susan said, is engaging those trusted messengers and those communities, helping them with information and resources to help them get that message out to those communities.
So what happens first? The census is going to start pretty soon. What will people see when they get the first information about the census? What will that look like?
The first mailings will go out in mid-March, so we'll blink and the mailings will be out. And it will invite, for most people in Minnesota, it will invite them to go online to fill out their form online. For a small proportion of those living in the state, they will receive a paper form right away. And what will happen if you do not fill out that form, or you do not go online to fill out your form, is you'll receive another mailing, again inviting you to do so. If you do not respond to subsequent mailings, eventually you will get a paper form. Everyone will have the option to fill out a paper form if you don't want to go online. And you're also able to respond by telephone.
Oh, that's a nice option.
Yeah, Susan, is there some point at which if people respond, they won't get another card or letter or form?
Yeah, so what the Bureau has designed is that once a form is scanned by the post office, it registers back at the Bureau, and they should not receive it. There may be a few that cross in the mail, but they should not receive subsequent mailing after mailing after mailing. Absolutely.
So a real incentive to get on this right away and fill out the...
That's right. And I'll say,
online.
By the end of April, if they don't answer the form, that's when census takers come out to doors and start knocking face-to-face to collect that information in person. And that can be a real incentive, too, to fill out that form, because those census takers only go out to houses that don't respond.
Right.
I was wondering how the homeless get counted. I mean, they're not going to be able to get even a postcard generally. So how does that work?
Yeah, so there is an operation. Everything in Census Bureau speak is an operation. There is an operation specifically to count homeless people where they are. If they are in a shelter that they stay in normally, they're counted at that shelter. Even if it's an overnight shelter, they're counted on census night in that shelter. So specifically working through the organization where people stay. If people are out on the streets, unsheltered on census night, there is another operation that goes out to count people where they are. And part of what we're doing through local organizations is making sure that everyone is aware that that's what's going to happen, so no one is afraid or surprised by it, that local providers tell folks, this is how this works, and this is how census takers will be making the count on April 1.
Okay. Now, college students are their own particular entity.
Well, and that's a great point. We've answered a lot of questions, and we provided some tools, on our website and others. The college students fall into basically 4 categories. If you're going to college living at home, you're counted at home with your parents. If you're going to college and you're in a dormitory, then the university counts you similar to people in other group housing. Then that'll be where you get counted. If you're going to college and living in an apartment or something of that nature, then you respond to the census in that apartment or where you live. And then finally, if you're a college student who's abroad for a semester, then you don't get counted. And that just because you're not living in the country at that point. And so it can be complicated about what you respond to. And so if you're a parent with a child at college, if they're living at college, in our case, our daughter went with college in Iowa, and so she got counted in Iowa. And so just keeping that in mind.
I've heard that hurts the hearts of many mothers.
Yes, because they're not
their
being
children
counted.
are not counted in their own. I will say the group that we're most concerned about as far as college students go is the group that are living off campus. And that is because the housing that they're in can be hard to find. Sometimes it might be, multiplexes that we're not sure that we're not sure kind of how many units are in there. We're not sure how many people. And the college students themselves may not know that they are responsible for counting everyone who's staying in their home.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge issue.
Right.
Yeah. So, what about people who are scared to give out their information? Is there information out there about how all their personal information is going to be protected?
Absolutely. So the Census Bureau, the data that it collects is protected by special laws unique to the Census Bureau that protect the data from being released at the individual level for 72 years. So any data that goes into the Census Bureau cannot be released again for 72 years except for at the aggregate level, meaning at a higher level than just the individual person. So the data that are collected in 2020 will not be released until 2092, which is a number that kind of, we don't talk about numbers like, or dates like 2092. It is way out in the future. This may not be convincing to folks who are fearful, but people who are spreading the news should know that the data really are protected by specific laws just for the Bureau. It's not like other data that's collected by any other state or federal agency.
Right, and I think it's really important. There's multiple layers of encryption that the Census Bureau uses to protect that. Another thing is that everybody who works for the Census is held to that law, and they're required to maintain that confidentiality. Whether it's somebody who works at the Census Bureau processing forms, or it's the worker who comes to your door, they are all under that same law to maintain that confidentiality.
So really, no census data can be traced back to an individual. Their information will be used in the aggregate to inform a lot of other things, but not their personal specific information.
That's right. And I'll also say, we're talking about very basic demographic information. We're not talking about sensitive data that we're used to putting into our laptops anyway. We're talking about things like age and race, ethnicity, sex, very, very specific, very, very kind of demographic.
So those are the kinds of questions that are going to be on the online or on the paper.
And there's really only like 7 questions.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's your name, it's your date of birth, there's one question about Hispanic, non-Hispanic, gender, and race, and then there's a national origin question, which basically it's whatever you identify yourself to be. I've talked to the Demographic Center about this because people were confused, and that's really it. I mean,
It's a home ownership question
Homeowner-
too,
yeah,
but
exactly.
really they're basic, you're right, just basic stuff.
Nobody's
Yeah.
asking you for things like social security number, credit card. If anybody starts asking for really
That's a
personal
good point.
information, red flags should go up. And there's a number to call to find out, one, to report potential fraud. There's also a number to call if you want to check if somebody's a census worker.
Oh.
And the Chicago office say, this is the person who's at my door, and is this person a census worker? And they have an ID. They should be able to show you an ID. That shows they're a census worker, has a Department of Commerce symbol on it. So those are some things people can do. They should, if somebody starts asking a lot of personal questions, the red flag should go up.
Wow. So, talking about the census questions, are those census questions going to be available in different languages? How are people who aren't really fluent in the English language supposed to answer?
Yeah, so the form is available in English and in Spanish, and there's varying levels of language supports for an additional, 59 languages in whole. So there are kind of full supports for some languages that are spoken widely across the U.S., but there are other groups in Minnesota that are spoken a lot here in Minnesota, Hmong and Somali, for example, that don't have the same representation at the national level. But there are some supports there. They're just not, the form isn't translated. There's a video guide that kind of walks people through in English, in the native language, kind of how to translate each question.
Okay.
Yeah, and my understanding, Susan, is that there's 12 foreign languages that the form will be available in. And there's in those 12 languages, you can also do it over the phone. And that if you go to the
that's
Census
right.
Bureau site, there's when they're ready, they will post those phone numbers, and each language will have its own phone number that you can call. Because I had that question about, well, if somebody wants a foreign language form, you get an English form in the mail. How do you know? And
How do you get it?
yeah, how do you get the foreign language form? So they'll make call, but there's a phone number for each one of those 12 languages.
Are there any particular scams out there that you're aware of, or that people need to be aware of? You mentioned if people ask you for specific, like your social security number.
I think
anything else?
not that I'm aware of yet, but I think we are already readying ourselves to kind of combat that, to counter that, because this is, in essence, this is a whole operation that is legitimately collecting information about everyone, which is something that typically sets off red flags for folks. So I think everyone needs to be aware if they're hearing things that just aren't right, to call that number and make sure that what you're hearing really is legitimate.
Good advice.
I think people should be aware that there'll likely be things in social media or elsewhere where people try to intimidate or scare people from participating in the census for whatever reason. And that people should be advised to exercise some healthy skepticism in the face of those kinds of things.
That's good to know. Now, if people have questions, they've gotten this form online, if they have a question about filling it out, do you have numbers that people can call? Want to talk about those numbers?
So there's all kinds of libraries across the state and
library.
organizations that are joining an effort to be a questionnaire assistance center.
Oh.
And on our website, we have a list of all the questionnaire assistance centers that they're still forming. They're still coming online, but they're hovering right around 200 places where you can go and ask questions and have help filling out your form.
I think that list is going to have the hours.
It'll have hours, languages, so.
I think there's another resource that the Demographic Center has put online is the Census Help Desk, and that's a text system. If somebody has a question about census, it's basically MN 2020, which is 662020. If you text 662020 and then type in your question, it'll get back to you. It's an automated service, but it'll get back to you. And there's also, I think, services available that also will serve Hmong and
Somali and
Spanish.
Spanish.
And I think the Somali is offline. Yeah, there's like, they have an FAQ. There's an FAQ
Yeah.
line that you have for that?
So for the Somali, it's a number you call in and listen to different options. And for Hmong and Spanish, you can also text in and get a response in language.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great tool. And it also has a feature where if you want updates or reminders about the census, if you are really interested, you can do that also.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I know you were looking for census takers. Are you still looking for census takers? And what can people do to help?
You know, yes. It's
Everything.
still a need. I will say that Hennepin County is getting closer and closer to its goal, which is, our largest county, its application goal. That doesn't mean that it still has, or that it has reached the right number within Hennepin County, within each community. But overall, the numbers are looking much better for Hennepin County. The story isn't the same outside of Hennepin County. There are different counties that are looking better. Right now, we're at the beginning of February. They had hoped to have all the hiring done, or the applications received by now, and that's been extended just because we're just not
That's good
there.
to know. That's good for the public to
Yeah,
know that
absolutely.
the applications have been extended.
Well, a question, who can be a census worker?
Yes.
Who can work for the Census Bureau?
So you need to be 18 years of age and older. You need to be have an English language proficiency. You need to pass a background check. And they're really looking for people to come from the communities, to do the work in the communities where they live.
Do you need to be a U.S. citizen to work for the census?
So this is a point that people are a little bit confused about. At the beginning, and that's just because the answer changed during the course of the application period. At the beginning, the answer was you do need to be a citizen. But I think when the Census Bureau saw that it wasn't getting the applications that they needed, they opened that up to anyone who has the ability to work. So the legal ability to work, the visa to be able to work in the
You
U.S.
have a green card, maybe you're a green card holder.
That's right. If you're allowed to work in the U.S., then you can be a census worker.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
And is there any need for volunteers, like ordinary people? I think I read someplace that translators would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are plenty of places where people can plug in to help. And one really great way to do that may be through the league.
League can help them with that.
It may also be through their local complete count committee. Again, as Paul mentioned, that's a local committee that's focused on spreading the word about the census within each city or within kind of each cultural community of which they're a part. And that information is on our website too. You can find the person to call and say, how can I help?
Sounds wonderful. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think we should know about, either one of you?
You know, one thing that's of interest to a lot of folks is unique to Minnesota, and that's that we have a lot of snowbirds who tend to be around.
Snowbirds.
They tend to be gone around April 1st when the census, or even March when the forms start coming out. So one of the things I want people to know is that if they live in Minnesota for most of the time, they can be counted in Minnesota. But it's incumbent on them to go online and put their Minnesota address rather than their California address, their Arizona or Florida address. They really need to take the initiative to say, I'm in Minnesota most of the year, and so I will be counted in Minnesota even if I happen to be in Arizona.
I think, and that's a great question, because the other piece of this is if somebody has, a lot of folks have lake houses. And so they may get a notice at their lake house because the Census Bureau is looking at what addresses there are. They're not looking at where people live. And so if somebody gets one at their lake house and one at their regular home, they should only respond to the place where they primarily live.
Good point.
And there are people who maybe spend some time up at their lake house, but then there are other people who spend primarily at their lake house and have an apartment or condo in the city. So think about where you primarily reside, and that's where you respond, and don't respond more than once.
That's a really good point.
It's going to be tough to reach folks who have already left, and so that's something we're going to rely on our networks to say, hey, call your sister, call your auntie, let them know that they can be counted right here in Minnesota.
Well, and that's something organizations can do, is just
Right.
let their members know to get that information out there, that's what they need to do to
Right.
Be counted, and to be counted properly.
Right, and I think the other thing to emphasize is it's where you live as of April 1st. So people may respond in mid-March, they may respond in mid-April, but it's where you live, where you reside on April 1st.
But if they're snowbirds and are out of the country,
But if they're only gone for a vacation, if they're gone for a couple of months,
so they can
then
still
their
fill it
primary
out,
residence, they
even if
still
they're
should
not in-
respond toward that primary residence as
Okay.
April 1st. Now, if somebody relocates,
That's-
you know, they live in, they close one house on March 15th, and they close a new house on March 31st, then that new house is where to live on April 1st. And I may not get a census form in that or notice in that new residence, but they can still respond online. They can still respond by phone. They don't have to have that notice in the mail to do that.
wow. It does get complicated, doesn't it?
It's more complicated than you would think. I
It
think,
is.
you know, it seems like it should be just straightforward, just go count all the people, but they're moving around and they have multiple houses, and yeah, it's more complicated.
One last thing, can you tell me the websites people should go to for information for both of you? Susan, what's your website if people have questions?
Sure. So ours is mn.gov/2020 census.
Okay.
And for the League of Women Voters Minnesota is www.lwvmn.org.
And you can follow the
you
prompts
follow
on
it,
the
you
website.
look at it and where we stand, and there's also some things further down our page that says 2020 census. So it's one of our biggest issues this year.
Wonderful. That was very enlightening. Thank you both for being here. It's really important information to get out and make sure we get everybody in this state counted. So I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
No,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Kay.
The League of Women Voters grew out of the 72-year struggle to win the right to vote for women. And because of that, voting issues have been at the heart of what we do. But there are other things we do as well. We study issues, we take positions, and we lobby at the local, state, and national levels. We're nonpartisan, which means that we don't support or oppose political parties or candidates. Our South Tonka League is open to membership of anyone 16 years of age and older, and we serve cities in southwest Hennepin County. We invite you to join us. If you'd like to find out more about our league, you can go to our website, lwvsouthtonka.org. Finally, I'd like to thank the Lake Minnetonka Communications Commission for the opportunity to present this program, and thank you for watching.